What's up, everybody, and welcome. It is another beautiful Thursday, and it is another camera class. Today we're going to be doing intermediate cameras. Let me pull that guy up for us. We'll get started in just a second here. I'm going to go close the door so that way I don't have any interference and noise. But it looks like microphone is going. You guys have me. Perfect. Alright, give me 2 seconds. Let me close the door up. We'll get started. Alright, well, welcome in, everybody. So, last week we discussed about the intro to photography. It was really just a beginner for anybody who was brand new to the subject and was graduating from using their smartphone, and they maybe just picked up their first camera and they really just needed a walkthrough on the buttons and the layouts. In today's intermediate class, we're going to be breaking down more of the nitty-gritty parts of the camera. While everyone's digital camera is going to function a little bit different or act a little bit different, the most important part is going to be the controls of that camera. And it's going to be the manual controls for more specifically. Automatic is a great setting, and that's what we talked about last class using, was the automatic setting on the camera. As long as you can compose your composition within the frame of the camera, then the rest comes down to then you just kind of having the eye for it. Now on the flip side of that, composition plays a very important role in the camera, but the actual way that we take the photo is really important. Our control of ISO, that's light intake on the camera. Our control of shutter speed, that's the speed at which the shutters are closing and bringing in the light but capturing our image at motion. And then on top of that too, we also have then our aperture, which is going to be our depth of field that we're seeing. And we're going to break all three of those down, talk about how they're all separate and then how they all come together. And then we'll also discuss things about how we'll look at some sample images, I should say, and then we'll be able to kind of go from there too. Welcome in, everybody.
Hi.
Have a seat. We just got started. I just was about to start the first slide, so welcome in.
We can do this virtually?
Yeah, I have them on YouTube as well too.
Oh,
Yeah, they're all on the card.
I
So-
did not know it was, we could have done it at home.
Oh, you're fine, you're fine. Well, you're in this time. Welcome. So, first thing I talk about in the class is why do we go advanced point and shoot DSLR mirrorless camera? And the real reason that we're doing any type of extra camera is because for some reason we were taking photos with our phone, or maybe we had a camera years ago, and that's what we want to get back into. We want to start taking photos and enjoying the camera and getting the highest quality images that we can. Good. So the first thing I talk about in this class is the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. So I consider a snapshot to be a quick glance, something that we're doing quickly just to kind of maybe get an image in, or to, let's say, take a picture to send to a friend, something where we're not really doing a lot of time, we're just pointing and shooting. So this is a nice example of what I would consider a snapshot. This was done with a mirrorless camera by our escalator over there. We have a funny little mural that shows the sky rises of Chicago, but it looks like you're rising into them. It's really cool. On the next slide, though, I took my camera and I put on the manual controls, and I was able to play with things like ISO, aperture, my lighting, my exposure. And from doing that, I was able to bring in a lot more of the colors, and you can kind of see where I went with that. So not only is my composition more clean, things are even, but that blue from the sky on the ceiling pops a little bit more. The reflective glass and the materials on the escalator itself are really prominent now, and so those colors really pop. The shadows look a little bit more vibrant and dark, and then on top of that too, just the contrast between the dark and the light points. So the difference between taking with the automatic setting on the camera, and then the difference between going through and controlling the settings on the camera in order to get my image. So a snapshot is a quick image, something that's mindless. You take the photo, you're going to send it, do something with. But a photograph, a real photograph, is something that you have to put a little bit of thought process into. So the first thing, and we talk about it in the intro class, is to learn your camera. I put this up there because I think this is really helpful. That is the current, or maybe this is about a year to 2 years outdated at this point now, but mirrorless cameras on the left, you've got all your Sony lineup. Then next to that on the right side you have your Canon lineup, and then below you have your Nikon lineup. Those are just three of the main brands that you'll see, but there's other brands like Leica, Fujifilm, Olympus, even Minolta still makes a few smaller point-and-shoot cameras too, I just found out about. But there's tons of different models, and it's important that whatever model you have, you become as familiar as possible with it. They give you a real long book in your box, it's probably 3-4 inches thick. You can read that, that's great, but one of my personal favorite resources, go on YouTube, type in your camera model, there's going to be 100 videos on just the camera model you bought. Camera people, myself, we nerd out about this stuff, so we really like talking about it in depth, and for certain camera enthusiasts, they love their camera, and they'll talk about it for hours, so you'll find tons of information on your camera. But going into more intermediate, it's also important to talk about a little bit of editing. Now, we really don't focus on editing until the advanced class, and that's next week. But within the editing world, these are the four main apps that you'll see, or four main applications that you'll see. Adobe has been around, I believe it's since the early 90s, late 90s. They are the most famous right now, I would say, for their editing software. Photoshop and Lightroom are the two I would recommend the most. Photoshop is fantastic if you're looking to do some really intense editing on the photo. Maybe you don't like the background, maybe you took a picture and a car was in there and you want to get the car out of there. That would be a good reason to use Photoshop. It has tools that really can significantly help you change your image. Lightroom, on the other hand, that's more of going to be like your color adjustment or your sharpness adjustment. Lightroom is great for those who aren't trying to change their integrity of their photo, but maybe they want to make it lighter, or they want to make the colors pop a little bit more, or maybe they want to do exactly what you used to do back in with the 35mm film, where you dodge and burn above a projector, an enlarger, I should say. That's what Lightroom is more for. It's kind of that same play that you would have done in the darkroom years ago, but now you're doing it on a digital form. And then the last two, which I have little familiarity with, but I've seen them in action, is Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro. Both are excellent apps. Both utilize very similar technology to Photoshop and Lightroom. But from my understanding, it's a one-time payment for those, whereas Adobe, you pay monthly for those services. And they show them all on their website. But these are great resources too. Now, when we talk about ISO, f-stop, and aperture, there's only one way to get to all those settings. That's going to be through the physical mode dial of the camera. Also, can I get you guys water while you're sitting here? I got you. I forgot that I had that.
You read my mind.
I was going to say, I know it's terrible out there. It's so sticky. Thank you. Of course, guys. So, the mode dial. I like to consider this your gear shifter or your shifter in your car. This is the brains and operation of the camera. This dictates what your camera is going to do before you change any of the settings or do anything on there. So last week in the intro class, we talked about shooting on automatic. For most cameras, automatic will either be an 8, or sorry, I should say 8+ or auto. Sometimes there'll be a green logo, and sometimes there's going to be a combination of the two. So you got a green camera, auto on there. Auto on the camera basically means that the camera is going to dictate all of the numbers, if you will. It's going to dictate your f-stop. It's going to dictate your shutter speed, and it'll dictate your ISO. All you're doing is taking the camera and pointing it at what you want, making sure your lens is in focus, and then clicking the trigger and taking the photo. But with a camera, the coolest part about the camera is that you have the ability to manipulate every setting and feature on there. So that's what we're really going to be talking about today before we get into lenses. We're going to talk about those features. To go through the mode dial, so automatic is your first one. Program auto does exactly the same thing as automatic, but now you can change settings in the automatic priority, like your focusing ability, or like your white balance. Maybe your exposure compensation can be changed depending on your model. You have more ability to edit or change features on the camera, while it's still then going to do the rest of the work for you, that f-stop, that ISO, and that shutter speed. Now, aperture priority is going to control just the aperture of the camera. So that's going to give you the ability to control depth of field. And we're going to show a diagram and break that down with some images to make it make more sense. But aperture priority will be the A on the shutter. So if I go back one more, where we see just the A by itself or AV on some of these camera dials, that is going to be the aperture priority. And that gives us the control of depth of field. Also what we would like to call bokeh, if you will, in certain cases. Shutter priority, that's going to be the S on the camera dial or the TV dial. Now, I always tell people I still don't know what TV is, and that's because I keep forgetting to look it up. But TV and S, they mean the same thing, shutter priority. The idea of that is now you're controlling just the speed at which the camera is opening and closing those shutters. So for things like sports or action photography, shutter priority is a great feature to use. And then underneath that all is full manual. And that is going to be a combination of basically aperture, shutter, and program, where now you have complete control of the camera settings and you can do anything that you want with it. Now typically for a very beginner camera person, I would not recommend shooting on full manual unless you kind of have a understanding of it either from YouTube videos or from past maybe classes. It can become very daunting at first, and you might notice that your images are very dark or very light, or they look washed out, or your focus doesn't look right. And a lot of the times it's because you're going to full manual when you should just be trying to use auto first to get the hang of it. If you got questions too during any of this, please ask.
So, like when this, if it's on AV, that wouldn't be the automatic?
Nope.
Would it be the A?
Yeah.
The card would be the automatic?
So, and for your camera, it's a little different. Keep going. It's going to be that A with a plus next to it. That's your automatic.
Okay.
So yeah, for that's how they do automatic. So yours is similar in the sense that other has. So that's going to be automatic, but for video, because behind that, that's a film reel. It's real tiny, but if you look at it, you can kind of see
Okay,
that.
I sort of see that, yeah.
So A plus automatic, P is program auto, so you get to change some things. TV is your shutter priority, AV is your aperture priority, full manual, full video manual. This is their S&Q. It's a weird one. It's very similar to Sony. I have to do more research on it myself. But basically it gives you some dynamic control of like doing faster video or slower video if you want to time
So
lapse.
the auto with the film reel, that would be
Automatic video.
everything would take place through the camera itself. I wouldn't have to set up.
Yep. The other thing you can do too, which I always recommend, just stay on the automatic and press your red dot button. That's automatically going to start recording for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, any questions, just stop me immediately. And same thing for anybody online right now. Chat away if there's any questions and I'll answer them as long as they're appropriate over the video. So the meat and potatoes of what we're really going to be getting into is the exposure triangle. And this is what it looks like when you lay it out on a chart. So the three things that you're mainly focusing on when controlling a camera is aperture, shutter, and ISO. Now you'll see as the numbers change throughout the chart, things look a little bit different in each of the diagrams. And we're going to go one by one and explain each of the diagrams so it all makes sense. And then my favorite part is at the very end, we're going to look at some images and I'm going to break down what I see and how I'm using this chart to influence that. So first one we'll talk about is aperture. Aperture is your depth of field. Now, where depth of field is important with the lens comes down to what you're trying to achieve. When we look at a photo, there's two parts we can really break into, or we can break the photo into two parts just with the top of our mind. We can consider foreground and background. So what comes before the background and what is our background? So in this case, they make it real simple. For that F22 square, we have a set of pyramids in the back, and then we have this little stick figure waving. So that might be your typical vacation photo. You go to Italy, you're in front of the Colosseum, you want to get a beautiful photo of the Mrs. or the Mr. or the kids. You might want to use something like an F22 f-stop when you're shooting because you're going to get your background and your full foreground too. When you're on your lens, you're able to control what your aperture is, or on the camera itself. It depends all on the lens and everything else that you have. But with that being said, some lenses have the ability of going all the way down to f1.4. And what that basically means is that you're able to blur the background out almost completely and just focus on the subject matter. So if let's say you wanted to get a nice picture of me right now, I'm standing here, and you didn't want to get all of these glasses and things behind me, you could lower your camera's f-stop to its lowest number possible, and then from there you should be able to start to blur out the background. Now it's all dependent. because certain lenses won't go to this number. And that's because the higher quality the glass, the lower that f-stop is. That's why when you look at some of these lenses and they say they're $2,000, $3,000, the question might be, why is that? And it's because number one, their glass is going to be a higher quality, but then number two, the ability that the lens has to increase your depth of field and really blur out or negate the background and focus in on your subject matter typically leads to more crisp or clean images. Now, you get more of that as you continue to go. So from f22, it starts off really clear. f16, we start to lose it a little bit, but it's still pretty clear. f11 is where we start to see it gets hazy, and then it continues to get more and more blurred as you go down. So the f-stop, or that aperture, controls the depth of field. Look, you got a question? Nothing yet?
No,
Is this done through your programming, or is this done with the lens itself?
It's all dependent. So some lenses actually have it. There's sometimes rings on these lenses where you'll see that number. Because you've got
That's what I was looking for, and I didn't see that number.
Yeah, so you won't have them on the lens. But when they're plugged into the camera, let me give you an example. How's it going, Joe? Alright. When this guy's on,
you're late again.
Yeah, traffic.
so see that aperture priority on there?
Uh-huh,
Okay, you're gonna have this ring right up at the top here. So you see that little dial there?
right, yeah.
If we focus in, if I start changing that number, do you see how the f-stop's changing on the bottom?
Right,
That's the control. So for your lens, you can get all the way up to the 22. You can actually go a little further than that. They have all the way up to 29. And then you can continue to go down. Now with this lens, it limits you. It only lets you go down to the lowest being 5. So it's not a problem, but when you look at the screen there, about 5.6, that's kind of where you're at. You're in between 4 and 5. So you'll get some slight blur on the background and have more focus on the subject matter.
I probably want more of the 22 or 16 one.
Yeah, right.
Because like I'll be going to Alaska, so I wanna get,
Exactly. But let's say that you just wanted to get a really clean photo of yourself. Maybe you were at the bar or something, and it was like just nice lighting. Anything else? That's where then you'd want to use that. That's the difference. Or let's say that maybe you see a beautiful, just a flower by itself while you're doing all your stuff in Alaska, and you don't care about any of the snow behind it or any of the maybe ugly rocks. That's where you can then change that aperture priority, so you can just focus in on one thing. So that's where that comes into handy. Now, to kind of show that off in some image examples, I got these guys. So, for example, we'll start with our dogs on the left side. When we look at the dogs on the left, we can see that we're really crisp on the nose of the front dog in the foreground. That one looks perfect. You can see all of the little wrinkles and the hair follicles and everything. But when we look towards the back, we can see that that's a dog, but we can't make it out completely clear. Other than the fact that it has a pink collar, it might be a lady dog. But other than that, we can't tell if it's looking at us. Maybe it's looking a little bit further off in the direction. There's just something on there that we're not seeing. So when we look at our chart, that's probably sitting somewhere between an f5.6 and an f4, where you're still able to make out your background, but you're not able to see the finer details on that. Now, when we look at the squirrel on the right side there, we can make out that there's foliage in the back because we can see the greenery and we can see what probably is the rest of this branch going backwards, but it's almost completely gone. So we don't see the whole thing. So with that being said, if we go back to our chart, that one we're probably sitting more at an f2 or f1.4. So where aperture priority comes into play is that ability to dictate how much of the foreground and the background you're going to get. What is your main focus area? Mainly, what's your depth of field? And that's the whole point of aperture. Another thing we like to use for aperture is bokeh. Now, bokeh really only comes in depending on the lens that you have. Typically, when I talk to people about bokeh, it is going to be the aperture 1.8 or lower. Most lenses commercially available, unless you're going extremely high-end, 1.2 is going to be the lowest that you can go. Depending on the brand of lens, that can be anywhere between, I'd say, like $600–700 on some of the cheaper end ones, all the way up to multi-thousands. The glass, the way that it's coated, and the way that the glass is layered within the lens you have the ability to blur the background out almost completely, and you can get this kind of like, they like to say bokeh and polka, like polka dots, similar kind of a vibe with that one. But these would be Christmas lights, or just, you know, your average lights that you'd have on the holiday season behind it. But when you start to unfocus and you're really only focused on your foreground, those lights in the back start to turn into dots, and that's the bokeh. So why use aperture priority? And I think situations like this are a great example for it. I would say using aperture priority is great when you don't have things that are moving within a lot of speed. If things are slow, the environment around you isn't moving at a hustle and bustle, you've got maybe automatic ISO turned on, or maybe you know the ISO number that you want to be at. We're going to talk about ISO at the end, but you'll have the ability to focus in on the subject matter, and if you wanted to, when you're on aperture, you could really work to blur the background out and focus on our subject matter. But in this case, when you're speaking about Alaska, even too, for your trip, this would be a great way of getting everything in one shot using just aperture by itself, because then you'd still have control of your settings on your camera, and it gets you away from that automatic setting just a little bit. So now you're really using the function of the camera. Camera's still going to do everything else. It's going to give you your ISO, it's going to give you your shutter. All you're controlling is that depth of field and what we're seeing in the composition. Now to review that a little bit more, some lenses have the ability to go all the way up to f32. That is typically the best or the largest that I have seen. I could be wrong on that one, if anyone wants to correct, by all means. But f32 in this case, when we look at the far left, we can see the garbage can at this forest preserve or wherever we're at right now, maybe a national park. When we start to go a little bit lower on the f-stop, we're starting to blur that background out. Now the main thing in our foreground is this tree branch, bark, or center. As we continue to lower our number, we are getting rid of more and more of the background, but we're keeping our tree still in full focus. So from 32, you can see the blue garbage can. Maybe you're taking that photo and you really like that angle, but that blue garbage can is bothering you. You don't want to necessarily go to Photoshop and edit that out. So what you'd want to maybe do is just continuously blur until you get rid of it. So at f6.3, you start to lose that garbage can a little bit, and you probably wouldn't be able to recognize that, but you'd be able to make out a little bit in the background that that's maybe some water, and that's some yellow grass in the back, and you've got the tree. But once you get to that f2.8, it basically is all gone, and you really don't know what is behind that tree, if it is just more forest preserve or grass or tree areas, or, you know, is there a blue garbage can back there? You really don't know. The next thing we'll talk about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is going to be the ability at which your camera is closing and opening its shutters to capture the image. Shutter is basically going to dictate how fast those things are closing in order to get what you see. So in this case, we have someone that's running. We can pretend that maybe they're going on a light jog, nothing too crazy. The faster that we can shoot them in, the more crisp or clear we're going to get them in the frame. So if we shoot, in this case, at 1/500th of a second, we are going to get the runner in full frame for the most part. As we start to get slower, our runner is going to get more blurry. Now, the way they kind of show it within this is, and it's funny enough, you can see that the stick figure gets a little bit fatter right there. And then it gets a little fatter right there. And then once you get down to that 1/30th of a second, now you can start seeing that movement on the stick figure. Because now we're going too slow to get that person in full frame. As we continue to go even slower, we're going to lose even more of that image. And now it's going to get really blurry. So why would we want to shoot at a slower speed? What's the point of that? The point would be for the detail. When we're taking pictures, the wider our aperture is open, the longer our shutters are open for, the more that the camera is able to capture and bring in. But with doing that, if we have things that are moving, or let's say, you know, are in the frame that we don't want, we're going to get all of that. And that's where aperture helps you remove some of that with the depth of field, and shutter helps you capture your images at the correct speed at which they need to be captured. So to kind of give more examples of that, anybody who's doing sports photography, what I always recommend is to get a freezing action is to be a 1 in 1,000th or faster. If you're in Alaska and you see some whales going in the ocean while you're there, you're probably going to want to go to shutter priority and get your shutter at about 1 in 1,000th speed. That same dial that you were using, that little one, if you go to the T or the S priority or TV, depending on which one they have it at.
I think it's TV.
TV, perfect. Now when you turn your camera on and you move that dial, on the bottom of your screen you're going to notice that your shutter number is changing. And if you play with that, you'll notice that the larger the number is, the faster it's shooting, and the smaller the number is, the slower it's shooting. Again, slower, more detail, but if you have things that are moving, it's going to be blurry. Faster, the faster those shutter speeds are going to be closing, the less detail you're going to get depending on the camera type that you have as well too. The higher megapixels, everything else, that's where the sharpness really comes in and you get just a really wow factor on a photo. But regardless, 1 in 1,000, and you should be able to get things pretty crisp. When we look at the surfer dude, this surfer is in perfect stillness. We can see the muscles on his body, we can see the shading on his back there, but the parts that are starting to be blurry or washed out, funny enough, is the water. Because the water is moving at such a sporadic movement, and it's faster than probably our surfer is, there will be areas where the water will look blurry. But the main point or the main subject on this is our surfer. So as long as you're getting that image out of it, then you're capturing what you need to get.
So as long as I leave it at 1 in 1,000 and still go to the auto.
You go to the auto, but the thing when you go to auto is now the camera's going to just, exactly, it's going to dictate what it needs. So where using shutter is nice is, let's say that you're trying to use auto and it's whatever's happening in front of you, it's moving too quickly. That's where moving to shutter priority, the camera will do everything else auto for you. All you're doing is controlling that speed. That's where you then can go to that 1 in 1,000th and maybe even a little faster depending. My one friend does photography over at the United Center, and when it's always funny when the Jesse White tumblers come in. They do the flips off the trampoline, they're dunking the balls like crazy. They move through the air so quickly. So when he shoots, he's got to shoot at about a speed of 1 in 250, or 1 over 2,500th of a second. I'm terrible at fractions, but basically he's shooting at one of the fastest speeds he can get, just to see if he can get the detail before they hit the rim and they dunk the ball. It's important if you want that crispness.
So if we went on this good
The other nice part about using shutter speed or shutter priority is you can give motion, giving a sense of motion to the item. Now, if you've ever watched a hummingbird in real life, I always tell people, go on YouTube and look up a hummingbird flying at 120 frames a second. So if you look up hummingbird at 120 FPS, it's one of the coolest things ever because the camera is capturing the bird so fast that the bird's wings don't even look like it's moving. So the bird just looks like it's going back and forth like this the whole time. When in reality, it's closing and opening its wings 120 times a second. But the camera is working so fast it can get it perfectly still. The reason you'd want to do that is because you get to get this beautiful sense of motion. So in this case, you've got a hummingbird that looks like it was capturing a bug of some sort. The wings have slight blur to them. Those aren't perfectly still. But what is perfectly still is the beautiful yellow and green and brown body with that red beak. You get that in perfect clarity when you're taking that shot. So using a higher shutter speed or using your shutter priority, sometimes your images aren't going to come out 100% clear. Maybe when you're taking that soccer picture, the leg is blurry, but the rest of the body looks perfect, or the ball as it launches is blurry, but the rest of the body is clear. That's going to be something that you can play with when you're using that shutter priority. Same thing for Alaska. Now, with long exposures, we're on the opposite side of the factor, and this is one that I have to explain because I think it's important and it's something you can do, and it's really cool with your camera. On the camera, when you're playing with shutter priority, there is a way for you to do a long exposure where you're not closing the shutter in, 100th of a second. You're leaving the shutter open for maybe 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. You can decide to do that. When we talked about it earlier, I mentioned that by having longer exposures, you get better detail. And when you look at this image, the grass, or the moss I should say, on the rocks, the shine that's coming through, the light that's breaking through and hitting some of the foliage up there, you can see the different variations of green. They stand out, they're bright, they have really nice contrast to them, and they have a really nice reflectiveness too. The parts that are blurry are the water. And even then, the water has beautiful signs where you can see that the water kept falling consistently in some of these locations, and we have this very dramatic waterfall that you wouldn't naturally be able to get with a still camera if you just took a quick photo. This would have had to have been done on a tripod or by putting it on maybe one of the rocks by the waterfall there. And this would probably have been done for maybe 15 to 30 seconds where they let the shutter stay open to get all of the detail into the camera. So that's another thing that you can do with using long exposures. The other thing, when we talked about giving a sense of motion with the faster shutter speeds, you can also get that kind of in a sense with the long exposure. In this case, we have a gentleman who either set his camera up on a tripod or on maybe a bench of a train station. His bike is off in the corner there, and what's perfectly still right now is the platform, himself, the roof of the train station, and the bike. What's not perfectly still is the train that's whizzing past him, and you can see the light flares as it cuts by, and you can see everything else as it cuts by too. Now the other really cool part about this, and I explain to people, is because there's gaps in between the train cars, as that train is going, the buildings behind the train technically aren't moving either. So as that passes by and as that continues to pass by, the camera is going to keep picking up information, technically even behind the train. So that's why we can see these words or these other things right behind it. Those are the buildings or property behind the train station that's cutting through the middle of the train. So you're creating a sense of motion by having the train whizzing past, but you're also creating this very dramatic stillness because you haven't moved or you're not moving. The lighting up here looks phenomenal. You've got all these deep shadows and cracks and everything in the concrete that just look really standoffish. The asphalt on the bottom is extremely detailed. There's different shading as you look around. The bike, you can make up every little mud or detail on there on the bottom. That blue from his bike stands out. The red of his shirt stands out. So the long exposure can really bring out a lot of your camera's best qualities. It does take time and practice in order to get used to taking photos like this, and not every photo you're going to take is going to be perfect. So definitely worth trying out or experimenting with. But another thing that you can do. Now, I love this photo. I think this is perfect for it. Why do we use shutter priority? And I think if you're getting an image like this, that's why you should use shutter priority. If you're out and about and you're doing something that involves motion or movement, and all of your photos look like this where they're blurry, they're not in focus, it's probably because you're using the automatic setting or the aperture priority, or maybe you're using manual, but you're not quite understanding the point or the purpose of shutter. So shutter, again, is to help you with the movement of your objects as you're taking pictures. If you don't have things that are moving, you probably don't need to have the longest or the fastest shutter speed. You can have a little bit slower. And I like this example too. This would have been another one that was shot at about 1 25/100ths of a second, where you've got somebody in motion doing something that they're probably only in the air for about 4 or 5 seconds. So you need to be extremely fast in order to get that. And that's not necessarily you having your camera and being able to pull up quickly, but that is really just making sure that your camera is set to a nice speed and it's ready to get that image so that you don't miss something like this. The last thing we'll talk about before we get into lenses is ISO. Now, ISO is going to be the camera's ability for light intake. Anybody who shot with film before might remember the days of going in and you buy Kodak and it would have a number next to it, like Kodak 100, Kodak 400. Now Ilford makes film, and you'll see the same thing, Ilford 800, Ilford 100, and they'll even have black and white, all this other stuff. But regardless, the term ISO, there's a long-winded word for it, and I always forget what it is. But basically it stands for the property that these companies have built to make their film sensitive towards the light when you were shooting. Back when you had film, the only two things you were really controlling were your shutter and your aperture. What's your depth of field on your lens, and then what's your shutter, and then how's your focus. That was all you were doing on a film camera. The ISO was dictated right out of the box. Whatever film roll you bought, whatever number was on that film roll, that was your ISO the whole time. When DSLRs came out, it gave people for the first time the ability to change that sensitivity at any point in time that they wanted. And so when we look at ISO, we're looking at its sensitivity towards light. How does your camera react when light hits the sensors, and how does it add or illuminate to your image? So we'll start at ISO 100. When we look at this, we've got the same image, and they tell you at the top, same shutter speed and aperture, but the ISO changes from photo to photo. Your first ISO on the top there, you don't get a lot of color or variation out of the sunset. Not saying it's a bad sunset, but it's a little dark. The pier is dark, underneath the pier is dark, and honestly, if you're sitting further back, you might not even notice that this is a beach right here, or that those are nice waves that are coming in. When we get to ISO 200, now we're really starting to get that full array, that full sunset. It's gorgeous colors, you've got all these different variable colors. Still a little dark, especially in parts when you get to the top up there. Now, the beach is starting to become more illuminated. We're starting to lose a little bit of that shadow underneath, where instead of it being so dark, now we're starting to get a little more color off there. The reflectiveness of the water is starting to show slightly. I think the sweet spot for me personally is the 400 though. 400, you're getting all those deep purples, blues, reds, yellows, oranges. You really see the sunset really clear and beautifully. You get the beautiful waves on the water there, or wrinkles or ripples in the water. Color coming from the sky is really sharp. You know there's a beach. And then the dock itself is still dark, but it has dramaticism to it, especially with all the other color that's on the page too. 800 I don't have an issue with. I do feel like parts like up here are a little bit washed out now, but still, same idea. So much color and variation, beautiful shadows that are coming underneath the bridge. We can make out the ripples in the water. We know that's a beach. So again, using ISO is as simple as just changing the numbers if you're not using auto ISO, but using ISO will really help bring out color or bring out variation in your photos. And it's an important thing to play with.
So, with the ISO,
Yes.
I know if you're trying to capture, let's say, like the bird's wings, and you're setting your camera on manual or a super fast speed, sometimes you'll get a warning light in your camera going, hey, this isn't going to work. You're trying to tell me to do something, but it's not going to work. So I know with ISO you can increase your ISO to expand, to allow your camera to accept a faster shutter speed that you've set it for, or the other way around. By lowering it, you can allow your camera to go even slower if you're trying to do more of a
100%.
right?
Because the more with the shutter speed, that also dictates how much light is coming in. So shutter and ISO play together. Sometimes what I recommend to people is if that's becoming an issue for you, especially on the camera side, where it's trying to give you those warning messages and it's saying, hey, it's not going to work, or you're getting something where it won't shoot, you can do two things. Especially in Sony, you can go into the Sony menu and you're usually able to dictate what your minimum ISO is and what your maximum is. And then you can set the camera to automatic ISO. From there, it'll use its lowest number and its highest number, and it's going to find you and pinpoint right between the two.
That'd be a program.
Yes. You should be able to do that in just your standard ISO, it's in the ISO of the...
But not manual.
Yeah, you should be able to do that manual. We can take a look. But, yes, depending on what you're setting your ISO to...
So it allows you to cheat your camera to, sort of cheat your, whatever, your settings a little bit. Right?
Exactly. The auto ISO helps you cheat a little bit because then you're not dictating what exactly you want for it. The camera's doing that for you. But in a lot of people's cases, they don't need to necessarily set the ISO every single time. Some professional photographers will, and they'll swear by it, but others will just say that the automatic is just fine. They're getting everything
If you don't
else.
have a tripod, you could increase your ISO to, get some more stuff in focus, right?
Slightly. Now that's where the next thing comes into play though, because ISO equates to noise. And when we have noise on the image, that's where we get that graininess, we get that blurriness, we get things that people don't want. So when you're using a tripod, you can technically increase your ISO, but it might not deliver the effect that you want to get. So using ISO really comes down to you understanding how much light is available in the area, and then kind of going from there. One of the things that I talk about in my intro class in Canon, you're using one of my favorites because it has that info button on there. When you're shooting, you can stick to just shooting automatic. And what I tell everybody in my intro class to do is keep taking photos, and then when you're done taking photos, hit the playback button on the camera and look through all those photos. Let's say you find one and you're like, this is the gem, this is the best photo I took all trip, whatever. You can click the info button on that photo and it should tell you what its aperture was, what its shutter was, and what its ISO was. I tell people to use that as your education tool to figure out exactly what you need to do, because the hardest part with photography is that there's no one answer to any of this stuff. Everybody has a different way of kind of taking photos or doing stuff, and they all base it off of past judgment, past photos that they've taken, and they've learned from those. So as you're shooting, you might realize that on an overcast day, ISO 400 is more than enough for me. But you might say, wow, it's beautiful, it's sunny, I'm going to go down to ISO 100. Or maybe it's really dark and you've got a street lamp in the corner and you're like, I want to get this image right. Maybe you bump up to ISO 800 or 900. You can dictate all of that based on past experiences. And I like that info button specifically on the Canon because it breaks all of that down in a really clean format. So I would definitely use that to just make it a little bit more concrete with this stuff.
So if you had a low light, you could use the ISO to allow you to take a picture in lower light as
Exactly.
well, right?
That's the key. But if you're now doing that in a situation where, let's say you have a lot of light, like for example, this is the same image taken 2 times and then put together. When you're using ISO 100, you can tell that it's probably sunset time in New York. You've got a good amount, I think this is New York, I'm pretty sure that's the Chrysler building. If I'm wrong, I'm so sorry. Any history buffs. ISO 100 was used on this, and it was pretty perfect. The lens was so-so because the image is still kind of blurry and not in perfect focus, but the image is clean. There's really nothing there that's super grainy. Now, we jack that ISO up to 3200. For a lot of DSLRs, that was the highest number you can go. When you look at these Sony cameras or even Canon or Nikon, Leica, you're looking at something that is going to be almost 50,000, 60,000 ISO. So you can jack it up all the way real high if you want. Is it necessary? Probably not. Unless you're shooting in a real dark cave and there's a torch 500 feet away, that's probably the only time you really need to jack your ISO to the highest number possible. But if you're shooting, for example, in a sunset period and you're in a big city where there's lots of lights and other things that your camera is going to take in, having something so high is going to give you what I call the 1990s tube TV when it's left over, that's static. So it's going to give you this grainy complexion. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's all dependent on the style of photo you're trying to go with. For example, when I shoot, I have my professional camera, which is my Sony, it's a full frame, and I keep my ISO at a relatively low number depending on the environment that I'm in. A lot of the times I run on auto ISO too, because if I'm going in and out of different spaces, I like auto ISO for that reason. And I have another slide that explains that a little bit more. Now, on my other camera, I have a Fujifilm camera. It's my crop sensor, and I have an 18 to 55 lens that I take everywhere with me. It's my vacation camera. When I'm shooting, I only shoot at 800 ISO. And the reason being is that it gives my photos a little bit of grainy complexion. Mixed with all the other settings that I've changed on my camera, it almost looks like a 35mm film negative if you were to pull one out. So I want that camera to function closer to what my 35mm would have looked like when I was shooting on those still. When I'm using my Sony, I want the crispest, cleanest image possible because I'm usually using that for events or for whatever private thing I'm doing with my camera. So again, ISO is dictated to anyone who's using it. You can use more, you can use less, but it really comes down to you. The most important thing to keep in mind though is that ISO is the amount of light sensitivity your camera has. The higher you put that number, especially when there's more light in the area, the more noise you're going to get, the more grain. Auto ISO. So I do think auto ISO is one of the best things to use, and if I'm being honest, I would recommend using auto ISO more than anything else. And the reason being is because if you are in and out of different locations, you know, for example, let's say, my favorite example, I had a mom who came in a while ago for prom season, and she was telling me that her kids were going to be taking photos outside at this one person's house, then they were going to go to this fountain. I actually think they came into App to take photos. They were going to be indoors for that too, and then they were going to take photos at the high school before the dance itself. So she was asking me, what do I recommend for her camera settings? So I told her to shoot, you know, with her aperture priority, so that way she could focus on getting the couples in focus, maybe getting everything around them if they're by the fountain, because you want those details of locations. But the next thing I told her was to use automatic ISO on the camera. Reason being is because the camera then allows for the fluctuation of light that you're going to be going through. When you're outdoors, you might have overcast, you might have a lot of sun. That's all going to change what the ISO of your camera would register to. Now when you're indoors, you're going to have less light, but you're going to have fluorescent light. So that's also going to dictate the ISO. In this room, we have very warm light. We also have can lighting that's recessed into the ceiling, so you have dimmer light that's uneven. It's kind of scattered. When you look throughout the room, you'll see just kind of bright spots where they fall, and then other spots where they don't. ISO is going to change with that. So if you're going to be going in and out of different situations or different environments, while it is nice to have a number in your mind and to be familiar with that, keeping it on auto ISO lets the camera do that for you, and now you're just focused on the shutter and the aperture priority of your camera. And if that still doesn't make too much sense, or that still is confusing, then using either just the shutter priority or the aperture priority, so you just focus on one of those is great, or then just go back to automatic completely, and just let the camera dictate for you, and then shoot through the frame to get the best image. Now, let's review that before we get into some lenses. F-stop, or your aperture priority, is going to be your ability to blur out the background. This image is kind of small, but if you were as close as I am, you could probably really see it. F16, we've got our two stuffed piggies sitting on the couch. We can see the couch and everything else, the wall, etc. It's all there. As we slowly start to lower that number down, we are now losing the background. And that couch, the pillow that's on the couch starts to blend in with the wall. So now we start to lose our background, and our main focus becomes our two piggies that are sitting here.
I thought they were on a bed.
Exactly, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It kind of, I would say it looks like an L couch to me, because there's a little gap right here where I can see that the color shifts. So I imagine that's the part of the couch that goes down.
Closer up there, I can't see that from back here, but.
The next thing we got is shutter speed. When we look at the shutter speed, at 1 in 1,000, we've got the hand coming down to hit the nail on the piece of wood. But we can clearly see the hammer and the hand, and we've got a good amount of light, everything else. Now, as we go slower and slower, we're getting more blur on the hand and the hammer until we almost can't see it. The other thing that's important to remember, and you were mentioning this, John, when you were talking about ISO and shutter, is when we start going lower and lower on there, you're going to notice that your image gets darker. So when we look at the first image, it's very light. When we look at the last image, it starts to get more dark. And that's because the slower we go, the less light that, the less light that's really coming into play on these guys. And so with that being said, the camera starts to get darker and darker as you're going. And that's the important part of either using all of these together or all of these separately. Because if you're using just your shutter priority, your camera is going to adjust its ISO and its aperture based on whatever number. So if you're shooting at 1/4 of a second, it might jack you all the way up to f16 to bring in the most light, and then it might bring you to like an ISO 400 to help you with that light compensation. If you're shooting on something like maybe a 1 in 1,000, it's probably not necessarily going to need the f16 because it's a lot of information that your camera is trying to get. So it might lower you down a little bit to like an f3.5 or 4.5 to make the shutter perform a little bit faster, to keep your ISO maybe at a lower number. So again, the camera can make those split decisions for you. That's not something that you need to grasp or understand right away. It's only something you need to know if you want to do the full manual right out of the bat. When we go down a row, ISO, we've got the numbers as they continue to go up. The best way to look at this, when you look at ISO 100, you have the penny, you can see it's copper, you can see the color, you can see the texture of the penny, the cent written across it, and then it looks like it's on a wooden table or a piece of stained black wood. You can see the grain of the wood, all of the different shadows and complexions on there. As you start to raise that number up, the penny starts to get a little more washed out, and the wood starts to get lighter and lighter and lighter. What's happening here is that by raising our ISO up, we're increasing the grain count. By increasing that grain on there, we're slowly starting to wash out some of the most important parts of the image, which could be just that detail, that color. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that ISO is going to help us with our sensitivity towards light, but if we go too high with that number, we can start to make our images grainy or pixelated, and it just won't look proper. Last thing we'll talk about is the exposure meter, and then we have lenses too. The exposure meter is going to be your cheat code on your camera. Now, some people will have an exposure meter dial on the physical camera. Others will have it inside the menu system. It's all dependent. But exposure is very different from ISO, and I think that's an important thing to remember. The two can kind of communicate with each other, meaning that if you start changing your exposure, it's going to change your ISO slightly in one way or the other. If you change your ISO, it's not going to change anything on the exposure. That's a weird thing to think about, but it does that. So, for example, when we look at some of them on the cameras, this is typically the two different types that you're going to see, and you might see a combination between the two that changes them up. But either you're going to have a home plate, or you're going to have a 0. Whichever one you got, that is your starting ground. That's the exact middle, meaning that your exposure isn't too high, nor is it too low. When they show the numbers, that's going to be your stop. So in exposure, they have stops, similar to your f-stop, similar to your shutter speed. Those numbers, those full numbers, dictate that you either went down to or up to. Down to or up to. When we look at those, when we look at the frame, it's going to change the entire exposure of the whole frame. So when you're taking pictures, what I would recommend, especially on auto, get ready, focus, take your picture, and then look into your camera to find out where your exposure compensation is and play with that. If you go darker, it's going to make everything in the frame darker. You might then lower your ISO or raise your ISO depending on the number as well too. But when you start to look at it, it might take things like, let's say you were taking a picture of the water here at the water fountain, or at the fountain that we have. We've got a natural sunroof that comes on the top, so we have light that penetrates through that glass and hits the water. We have a reflective quality that comes off the water there. So by having that, we might get a light that we don't like, or maybe just something on there just doesn't, it looks too harsh. What we can do is we can lower our exposure compensation, or exposure meter, and that's going to help then maybe mitigate that really intense light that's reflecting off. Same thing though, let's say that we take a photo and it just looks too dark, we didn't get quite what we wanted out of that. We could raise our exposure compensation, and if we do it in such a way that we don't blow the whole image out and make it whitewashed, we should be able to cut through those darker spots that maybe we missed with ISO, and we should be able to help the image just get a little bit lighter. So exposure compensation, or the exposure meter, isn't necessarily ISO, but it works hand in hand with ISO in a sense, where it takes the entire image's composition and makes it either darker or lighter. Your ISO is still going to control the sensitivity at which your camera is reading light in the area, but your exposure meter is going to take the composition or the frame and make it dark or light. And then now going back into it again, full manual means control over both aperture and shutter priority on the camera. ISO is still going to be one of the few settings on the camera that it really doesn't matter. If you're shooting on with ISO, you can always change it from auto ISO to non-auto ISO, even in full manual. So you have that control. Do you want a water bottle, Greg?
I'm good, thanks.
Awesome. So, next things we got. So, in this part, I'm going to show some images. I'm going to break down what I see in the images, and I'll kind of give more context for why I see them. We'll go through these a little quicker because we're already at 6:30, and I do want to make sure if you guys have questions you can ask because we still got to talk about lenses. So right off the bat, this photo could have been done with a tripod or it could have been standing up. My reasoning for why a tripod could have come into effect is because you have really nice still lines on this guy. But overall, and we'll reference my last camera class a little bit, the intro class, I throw out some terms that are used in the art world or in the community of photographers when you're talking about composition. When we look at this guy, we have what we call a vanishing point. The vanishing point is going to be a point somewhere on the image where any intersecting lines that we have all vanish to. So if you really were to think about this, these lines that are coming through, you've got one going there, they all are coming back to that point and hitting there. This is doing something similar, but obviously with the roof it's kind of going this direction, with this one it's going there. But if you look at the top up there too, those lines are now all coming down to a point, and if the building were to continue to extend, it would have to vanish at some point. And that's what we would call our vanishing point. From there we can create a horizon line, and then we now have our foreground and our background. Basically the separation, during the intro class I use a lot of water and beach photos. Those show kind of what I'm talking about more literally because you have the water meeting then the skyline. So the water line meeting the horizon line. In this case though, the image looks darker. So my imagination with ISO is that it's going to be a little bit higher. And where I'm seeing graininess on there are some of the darker points on this image. The other reason I think ISO is a little bit higher is because when I look at certain windows, those lights look very, almost like a mad scientist. They look very bright when I don't think those lights would be that bright, otherwise people in those rooms would be blind. So the ISO looks like it's turned up maybe to an 800 level on this case. I would say aperture priority, everything is in pretty good focus, so aperture is probably closer to that 22, 32 range. Shutter speed in this case probably doesn't matter too much. Given that there are some nice details in the bricking and there's nice coloration everywhere, I don't think it was a very fast exposure. I would have probably been a little bit slower. So maybe 1 and a hundredth of a shutter speed, maybe a little bit slower than that. Now we've got our cherry blossoms here. When we look at the cherry blossoms, we can see clearly that these couple branches in the foreground here are very nice in focus. This one is kind of slightly out, but this one especially, these two that are kind of going together are really nice. So I would say that that aperture is probably somewhere closer to a 4 or a 5, because we can still make out the background being the bushel of other cherry blossoms, but we can't see them clearly enough. So probably like an F4, F5, you're getting some of the background, but we're really focused on those flowers. As far as ISO is concerned, I don't see any grain or anything bad within the darkest points of this image. So I'd imagine our ISO is probably kept at about maybe 100. And then same thing for shutter. I don't think shutter would be really fast in this case because unless we have a really strong wind blowing the branches throughout, it's probably going to be a little bit slower, maybe 1/100th of a second, just to capture all those details, those shading and shadowing where you have the darker blossoms that haven't popped yet, and then some of those really washed out points where the sunlight is really breaking through the leaves of the plants. We got our firemen here lined up. So fireman 1 in the foreground, fireman 2 in the background. This is very similar to that dog image I showed earlier. Our first fireman is in nice perfect focus. Our other fireman is blurred out. We can tell that it's another fireman though because it has a walkie-talkie just like our guy has and has the hat just like our guy has. Except now, you don't know. Is he looking at you? Is he looking at him? Is he looking over there at maybe something that just happened? Who knows? But within that, it's blurred out to a point where we can tell that it's another person, but we can't make out the finer details of that person. So I would say that's probably also somewhere between about a 4 to maybe 5.6 or a 6 as far as that's concerned. ISO in this one, the lighting is very dramatic, but again, there's not a lot of, graininess or grittiness anywhere on the photo. Given that it looks like the tone of the lighting is a little warmer, I probably would say our ISO is somewhere between a 200, 400, maybe up to 800, depending on that lighting situation, but I think that's pushing it. And then other than that, aperture, ISO. Shutter-wise, this probably doesn't have to be too fast of a shutter, unless these guys are walking towards us. Maybe that's when you'd use a faster shutter. But the detail and everything else on the image, 1 in 250th of a second, 1 in 100th of a second, I think that would be more than enough for this image. Now we have a RAM here. I have been trying to figure this out, but I think I figured it out with my class last month that this is probably taking a picture at like a National History Museum where the goat would be in stillness, because I can't imagine you being able to get that close without it trying to ram you. But that's just me. The detail is phenomenal though. When you look at the horns, you can see all the ribs, the coloration on the horns, even where some of the blue light from maybe a reflection coming in is hitting. You can see the detail in the fur, the coloration, even as you get towards that bottom area where it gets darker, it still looks clean. So in this case, I don't think ISO is high at all. I probably would say 200 to 400 at max for the ISO. The background is slightly blurred to the point where you can't really make out what it is. It does look like it's a nature scene of some kind, because this kind of looks like snow. Maybe this is the trunk of a tree, some dead branches on the floor. So probably the same boat, 4.5, 5.66 for your aperture priority. ISO, like I said, about 2 to 400. Shutter, again, unless this is a real goat that's moving, a real ram that's moving, maybe a faster shutter speed so you could get out of there just in case. But it also could have been done a little bit slower, only because of how much detail is physically on this animal. You can see all the little hair follicles, all the ribs on the physical horns. So it really makes me feel like there is probably a longer shutter speed with this. Maybe something closer to 1 in 100th of a second, maybe a little bit slower than that, 1 in 50th of a second, maybe even possible too.
You think somebody could have shot that with a zoom?
Possibly. The background to foreground separation really isn't that crazy. So it definitely could have been, because the lowest you can go with a zoom is 2.8, and I don't think that's a 2.8, I think it's a little bit higher. So yeah, absolutely, I think that could have been shot with a zoom.
Because it's no background, so I don't see.
True. I mean, but you go to the Field Museum and they've got, the realistic kind of settings that they put those animals in when they stuff them and everything. You see the lions and they've got all the fake foliage and everything else behind it. So maybe
So you're saying it's not even a live animal?
I don't think it's live. Personally, I don't think it is. But I could be wrong. If I could find the source of where this image came from, I just love this image because I think it really clearly demonstrates all the little parts that you can separate.
I find fascinating is the point on the one horn compared to the blunt edge on the
right.
other one.
Yeah. Animals are great. Horns for that's so crazy.
How can that be?
I
just
saw.
right with the one side of the horn.
I saw the scariest thing on National Geographic the other day. I was flipping through. I love Shark Week. It's on Discovery, actually. No, is that?
Discovery.
That's Discovery that does Shark Week. I was flipping through watching some stuff, and I stumbled on Nat Geo, and they were following an elk that I guess got into a fight with another elk. And when they fight, they smack horns together. Well, I guess this one got its horns and took the other thing's head off. It was walking around for months with the head still on its horns. So at that point, it was just a skull and the horns on its own horns. And I'm like, oh my God, nature scares me more than anything. Yeah, literally, yeah. I was going to say, sorry if I ruined anybody's dinner tonight. But yeah, animals, be careful on safaris. All right, my favorite animals, though, dogs. So this is a great example of using more of your sports or using your faster technology. So here we go. You got the dogs jumping in midair to catch the frisbees. You are definitely going to be getting both of these images at 1 in 1,000th or faster. You can really see the detail and everything else on there, so the stop motion that they're able to get is perfect. So this is probably even a little bit faster given how fast a dog can run on all fours and given how fast a frisbee gets whipped. I probably would say this is maybe at the slowest 1 in 1,000, but it could go all the way up to maybe 1 in 1600ths.
And then we'd use a drive mode probably.
Yeah, absolutely, I would say. Using something of burst photography too to make sure that you're getting one frame at a time so you get each one crisp. That could be part of this too. The background's blurred out on both. This guy is definitely more blurred out than this one. With this one you can really make out that those are some trees and foliage in the back, but not really as quite. So I probably would say that's a 2.8, maybe a 3 at the smallest, or at the highest, but possibly a 1.4, 1.2. I just usually don't see that type of photography when you're doing stuff like this, because you want a variable zoom to make sure you get what you want in frame. Most people that are doing sports or action photography, having those more zoom length lenses, which we'll talk about at the end, those are more appropriate for situations like this. In that same boat though, this is definitely going to be more of a 1.2, 2.8, 1.8 in that range. You can tell, I can tell, that the shine back there and some of this red that's there, those look like cars. So I can tell this is probably a park that they're doing stuff at and they're taking the photos at. But still, this is a nice example of getting something that's faster speed with a blurred out background. Because the main point of your photo is the dog in action trying to catch the frisbee.
So what would the ISO be in the one on the left?
Probably probably 200 or 300, because the one on the other end would maybe be a 100, just given how light everything looks. The grass doesn't really have too much dark complexion. There is some variation between the grasses right there, and some up there too, but the dog's fur is probably going to be a darker color naturally. It just looks a little bit washed out in my opinion. So I think that 100 is probably more appropriate, whereas in this
You're gonna
photo,
have a large aperture opening at a really fast speed, right? And like I said, silver channel.
again, it's all dependent on what you have the camera set to on that stuff. They might also have auto ISO turned on for this because they're not as concerned, they're outdoors. This guy would be in the same boat. You're seeing some nice variation of the darker greens with the lighter greens. You've got that nice dark tree branch. But what catches me is the fur variation, where you can see the different colors on the dog itself. And so that's what leads me to believe that it's going to be slightly higher of an ISO, not necessarily too far off from this one, but slightly different enough where you're really getting the color and the variation in this.
I saw this a couple of weeks ago at one of your classes, and I've got a dog too, and I tried duplicating this. This is hard to capture.
No,
it happens so fast, right?
There is a really cool artist, I can't think of his name, but what he does is he puts an underwater cage on his camera and he jumps into a pool and he'll sit in there and he'll have the owner throw a tennis ball into the pool and the dog will then dive in to go get it. And the images are really cool. The dog trying to like fight through the water, its eyes are wide open and it's trying to like grab the tennis ball. It's really cool. But that's another example of using fast shutter priority to capture all those small details. And like John said, using a burst mode would also be nice here too. We don't really talk too much about it. In the intro class we talk a little bit more about it, but burst mode is the chance for your camera to shoot maybe 10, 15, 20 frames a second. So when you have something like this, if you've got the dog running through, if you're taking one image, the chances of you getting perfect are pretty far and in between. So when you're taking 20 though in 1 second, most likely at least one of those is going to be perfectly crisp. And that's the idea. This would be another perfect example of an action photography. So imagine you're watching a football game. This is Navy. I can't think of the college for that one. I know it's not Army. It's a blue school of some sort. They're going in for, or this guy's going in for a touchdown. It's a diving touchdown. He probably broke that tackle, and that's why the guy's on the floor. So he's diving into the end zone. ISO, given that they're outdoors, unless they're in a dome of some sort, this is probably done at 100 ISO. You have the intense shadow, probably because from where that sun is positioned on the opposite side of the field, it might be getting ready to either set behind a scoreboard or do something else, and that's why we're going to get these intense shadows that are coming underneath our players, and even by their feet there too. Now, with this one, you're definitely looking at a speed of a 1 in 1,000 or faster. I probably would say this is closer to 1,200 or 1,300 as far as the speed is concerned. And the only reason being is that football players, a little bit clunkier because they've got all the pads, and they are running down speed full force. But when you're sitting right in front of them, like this guy probably is, where when you're watching a football game, you see that one guy who's there at the end zone taking pictures from a safe distance. That's probably that photographer that's doing that. They've got a longer lens on, so they're able to zoom into the subject matter. And as far as our background goes, we can still make out those are the football players. And my clear example is that if you look at this, it's either the bottom of a 6 or bottom of an 8. Or, yeah, it would be a 6 or an 8. It doesn't look like a 5. There's no space in between. But you can make that out. So in my personal opinion, I don't think that the aperture would be something that blurs the background out too much. I would say this is probably closer to an f8 or maybe just above an f5 somewhere in that kind of range. The other thing I like about this too, when you talk about sports burst, I love turf because you get that little ability of all that like kind of stuff to flick up in the air, and it kind of looks just cool for in a way.
Run the tires.
Exactly, yeah. You get the tire. Yeah, that's from the rubber from the tires. But the fact that his hand is sliding in by the touchdown zone, and then all of that stuff is just kicking up as he's going, I think that's pretty cool. So when you're taking soccer photos, you get that shot, the grass comes up with it. Oof. And the last thing, I'll do another long exposure one. The reason I know this is long exposure is because when you look at the very small bottom there, you can see these red lines that cut across and go in one direction. And they even come back on the opposite side of the bike there slightly. Those are going to be trains. So you can tell that those are some track lines on the bottom there. This is a train yard. This person, this would, to me, would be a nice example of a not so great photo, where they wanted to get this dramatic shot of the bike, but they turn their ISO up way too high, or high enough that they're getting these bursts of sunlight, which they shouldn't be getting. They're also getting a little bit of grainy texture as well, but it's very slight. The thing that I'm really noticing on this one is going to be that it's a wider aperture, because you're getting the entire scenery on this. There is a slight blur, but not enough to justify anything crazy. So I would probably say this is closer to like an f16, f11, maybe like an f18.
So if the ISO was lower, would it be a lot darker?
Yeah, it would be a lot darker, and you'd get less of the light that would be coming through there, but the big thing is you'd get less of these light flare-ups. That's something that you'll notice.
It's a compromise, right?
Exactly, exactly. That's where maybe auto ISO would have been better for this photo. But I think it's a nice example of seeing where if you're playing with your camera and you start getting things like this and you have everything else set, it could be that maybe your ISO is just too high for that situation. It might be dark and you might only have these 3 street lights illuminating you, but those 3 street lights are brighter than you would think, and they're offering a lot of light to the subject matter of what you got.
But you'd lose the courtyard light.
Yeah, exactly. You might lose some of those guys. So again, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. I can't stress that enough. It's great that you're here. I'm really happy to see everybody, but take your camera outside and use it. Start taking photos, start practicing with it, because everything I just taught is useless unless you're actually trying to use it, because it won't make sense. If you're just reading all this stuff, it's a lot of mumbo jumbo, it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of things that you gotta memorize. But really where it comes into play is that discipline of practicing with that and understanding those numbers as you continue to shoot, as you continue to brainstorm outside of class. When I was first learning, I learned on film, so I find myself very lucky that I have the ability to kind of go from film to a digital camera. I used film for maybe 15 years of my life before I touched a digital camera, and so going into digital, I was like, this is so much easier than film. I can't believe it. But it only came with that understanding of how the camera functioned just by using your aperture and your shutter priority. My best accessories, or my best camera accessories that you can get, stuff that basically could be free. Practice, if you're going to go on vacation, you should have your camera with you. If you don't bring it, I don't understand why you bought a camera. Bring your camera on vacation with you. It's awesome. If you're taking anything else, do some classes. There's a lot of classes that are free out there. You don't have to pay anything for them. People just love talking about this stuff because the more camera knowledge that gets spread, the more that you're going to want to buy stuff with it. So that's kind of always the reality of the camera classes in a sense, right? YouTube channels, they're fantastic. There are so many people online who consider themselves the leading experts on cameras. Every year I go to this camera convention, and they always change locations. So they have it now in Kansas City now coming on in September. It's for the brand ProMaster. They're a large vendor portal. But they actually had a kid from YouTube who had about 1 million followers who came and did a press conference or a talk. And he was just giving not like tips or tricks, but he was just talking about what young YouTubers are looking for when it comes to getting camera gear, getting equipment to do the next thing. So I thought that was cool. Workshops are great too. I have a few people that come into the store all the time. There's a club that shoots out of the Botanic Gardens and the Chicago Botanic Gardens. The competition basically is that they all take pictures together. They all then rate each other's pictures, and whoever is in the top, they get to be the photo for their magazine for that month or whatever it is. I thought that was pretty cool. There's also a club that comes into the store a bunch. It's the O'Hare Shooting Club. They have special access to go on a specific part of the runway at O'Hare, and they can shoot the planes as they come in and out. And so they get these beautiful photos of planes taking off and landing. They were just on WGN the other day, really cool too. And then travel. Again, if you're doing anything, take the camera with you. You won't regret it. Just keep it on you so that no one takes it. Other things definitely recommended. Bag. If I had to tell you, you gotta buy 4 things. Those are the 4 things you need more than anything. And I think that's kind of 5 when you include extra battery, extra memory card. Definitely have a bag that protects the thing, that keeps everything safe on the camera. Having an extra battery and an extra memory card. I learned this the hard way the other day. I was doing some work for the Chicago Canine Rescue. I brought my camera with me with an SD card preloaded, and when I got there, I kept getting SD card error. And I guess I have not been listening to what I've been teaching everybody else. I didn't bring another card with me, so I had to go all the way home and waste about an hour and a half to go back and forth just because my card didn't work. Extra battery, get a lens cleaning kit. If you get any dirt, smudge, anything on the lens, never use your t-shirt. There's little fibers in there that'll scratch stuff on there. I'm wearing a wool vest, but even then, if I was wearing a regular t-shirt, just don't do it. Get a camera strap, get a tripod, external hard drive, a polarizer filter, ND filter, and then additional lenses. We're going to talk about some additional lenses here. That's the main part of this thing. So, in the camera world, we talk about date your body, marry your glass. Your camera body will die. It's not going to die tomorrow. It's not going to die in a year. But 10 years down the road, when you've been using this thing, maybe on your yearly vacation, or when the grandkids come in, or when your kids have big events, you're going to start to notice that it'll slow down. Maybe the image isn't as sharp as it used to be. There might be spots on some of your images because the sensor has gotten dirty over time. But that glass, that lenses, those big hunks of glass that you're buying, as long as you take good care of those should never deteriorate on you. No matter how much you zoom with it, no matter what you put on it, if you're taking good care of it and cleaning it, the lenses themselves should last practically forever. And most camera brands have made it where you're able to bring your old lenses over to a new system. Canon came out with the RF series. Prior to that, they had EF, EFS. Technically, you can get an adapter and bring all the old glass over to the new system, and there's no difference in using that other than it's just a different weight glass, if you will. Sony is one of the few. They've had one mount their entire existence. That's the E mount. They've had a few different ones like the A mount when they did a stint in the DSLR realm for a little bit, but primarily they've always been 100% E mount, making them one of the easiest and fastest products to find.
Is it true with Canon though, in their lenses, you have to buy their lenses because of the way they have their...
Right now.
It's like with Ford, when you had to buy certain, only Ford parts would go in, you couldn't go out and buy.
So, I don't think any of my vendors watch my videos, so I'm not worried. But basically, years ago, Sony basically was like, we don't think DSLRs are the future. We don't think that the DSLR game is going to continue. There's got to be something better than that. So Sony focused on mirrorless. And Sony was like, we're going to make mirrorless the best. About 10, 15 years ago, Sony became the leader in mirrorless. And with mirrorless becoming so powerful, so many, I'd say, amateur or hobbyist photographers started moving from DSLRs over to mirrorless. It was really the professional photographers that were like, I don't know about this yet. Like, I still think my DSLR is better. And then Sony really started to come out probably about 5, 6 years ago with with some of their really high-end cameras. $4,000 systems that had the biggest sensor possible that could take an image as good as the Canon 5D Mark II. I mean, it was just phenomenal. So about 5 years ago, Sony became the leading camera seller in the entire world. Sony blew everybody else out of proportion. So Nikon couldn't really get their act together. They were always kind of like, we're Nikon. Our glass is number one. You know, whatever. Who cares about mirrorless? Canon always said that they had the best color, that they were the number one for the processing of that, and they still stands true today. And then you have brands like Leica that are just a completely different beast in their own. But the main three that I would say are the number one sellers have always been originally Canon, then Nikon, then Sony. Now Sony took over and they've been number one, and it's really been Sony, Canon, Nikon. Canon about 3 years ago came out with their RF series, and that's what you currently have. You have the R100. So from there, that was their smaller model, but they came out with their R5, and it blew people out of the water because now they had something that could really stand up against a Sony and could really make the argument of which do I go with, what's my brand. Canon gets its highest ratings for its coloration, its focusing technology, and the ability for it to detect certain objects and just really have a sharp image. So those Canon cameras are so sought after for their color and for that image composition that it gets. So they're turning into going back into number one position because of their RF. The problem with that, though, is the fact that Canon is stingy about it. They're like, this is brand new technology, this is something we're so proud of. We don't want Tamron, we don't want Sigma, Voltrox, any of these third-party lens companies to touch our stuff, to have our proprietary technology. So that's the kicker. Canon, for the most part, if you want to buy a Canon lens for the RF series, you gotta buy it from Canon only. Nobody else is making them, or no one's allowed to make them. I should say legally allowed to make them. And that can be a problem because when you're shooting on like a crop sensor Canon camera, you can buy a full frame lens. It's not a problem. You're just going to spend more than you paid for the camera, but you're going to get a really amazing lens. And it's not going to have any disadvantage on your camera. It's just basically going to be like putting a really powerful engine in a Toyota Prius. You know, it's not necessary, but if you got it, you got it. It's, you know, I try to make car references. Those usually work with people.
I got you there.
Yeah. So date your body, marry your lens. That's my moral of the story there. You put majority, whatever you're buying on the camera body, you should be putting at least 70% of that total into your lenses. As a Leica user, you understand that with what you've had to get. Sony is in the same boat with that stuff, and as you start getting some of these higher end Canon lenses, you'll see that too. When we talk about lenses though, we talk about focal length. Focal length is written by a millimeter size. Now it's important, I don't understand it, and I've tried to research it, and I've asked people about it. No one has a clear-cut answer on why. That does not actually mean millimeters. That doesn't mean any actual use of like measuring. It is just how the lenses show their numbers. So focal length and zoom, they're basically the same. 70 millimeter, you're going to get more of a wide angle on this case. You're going to get the entire scenery. You've got the town in the background, the birds in the water there, and then you've got the greenery going around. As you start cutting in on that zoom, you're going to get more and more in focus on just that. Now what starts to happen with that though, is while the images or what's in the center gets closer, so does the background relationship. In reality of it, the background's really far away from those birds. But as we start zooming into those birds, that background keeps getting closer and closer and closer to us. So zoom is going to bring what we want closer to us, but it's also going to enlarge other things around it too. So it's important to remember that, because a lot of people think that, well, the background's still so far away, I'm just aiming for the birds. That's not the case. It's the entire frame. And when we're focused in on something like that, you're really going to notice that the background comes into play more. And I've got this kind of goofy little thing on this slide to kind of reiterate that. So this is going to be a portrait only. Focal length also comes into compression. The smaller your number, the more compressed or the more tight things will become. The bigger your number, the more fat or the more plump things become. So for example, When we show at that 20 or that 16 millimeter, his nose comes forward and he has a very narrow face. He looks almost like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. But now as we start to zoom out and we get closer to that 135, you can see that his face takes more of that traditional shape. He gets more of the oval, you can see the chin more prominently, his cheekbones go back into place normally, and the glasses also fall back more. The other thing when we look at this though, just what I was talking about on the zoom, he's standing that far away from the tree. He hasn't moved or switched. But the fact that we're changing that focal length, we are bringing forward or pushing back the background as well too. And that's where then the fun of maybe aperture comes into play, because then you dictate, do you want to see that background? Is it necessary or is it not? In portrait photography though, traditionally speaking, we'll talk about the trinity of lenses next after this. Typically in the portrait world, you want to be somewhere between a 35 to an 85. That is considered your prime portrait area. 35 still teeters on that wide angle, but depending on where your subject is when you're taking a photo, it looks really nice still. 85 will make things a little bit chunkier or plumpier, I should say, but it really helps with the background and that compression that we're talking about here. So the most common lenses that you're going to see nowadays, these are the traditional ones. You're going to get your kit lens. So when you buy a camera, if you buy one that has kit lenses, for example, you got that, you got the 2-lens kit for the R100, you've basically got something that is going to be equivalent to like an 18 to 55, and then a 55 to 200, I would imagine, right? What was the lenses that? Was it up? Yeah, 18 to 45, I think, and then the
50 200 on the
So for your world, basically, the kit lenses that you got, this would be your wide angle and portrait lens. This is going to be
210, yeah.
210, yeah. So that lens is more of your zoom. That's when you see the bird flying in the distance, or you've got like that really cool tree that's by itself in the middle of the woods. You want to zoom in and get that shot. That's the lens you're using for it. But now you and the missus are standing in front of the Alaskan mountain fronts. You might want to use something closer to this because you're going to get the more wide angle. You're going to see the entire scenery and not just zoom into the subject that you're trying to get.
So when I throw her off the ship.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. When you toss her off, that's where you get the wide angle and you get the whole scenery of the accident. But the kit lens, you're going to get it in the box with the camera. If you choose to go that route, it's going to be a cheaper lens, but it's going to give you the ability to start taking photos immediately. When we talk about f-stop, I'll make it real quick, but you got a 3.5 to 5.6. This is a variable aperture, meaning that this is its maximum aperture depending on what number you're at. And when you start at that 18 millimeter, it's going to start, and the lowest you can go is 3.5. Now when you start to zoom to closer to that 55, if you watch your camera screen as you do it, you're going to notice that 3.5 changes to 5.6 when you get to the 55. And that is just given that a kit lens typically doesn't give you the best aperture priority because it's just a kit lens. It's meant to just get you going and be a cheaper alternative to then you buying the more expensive variation of the lens. My personal favorite is the Nifty 50 lens or the Prime. Now, you can call it a Nifty 50. The reason they call it that is because the 50 millimeter is considered the perfect equivalent to the way our human eyes read things. So when we look at stuff as humans, we see in a 50 millimeter kind of style. A prime lens can be any number that's by itself. So it could be a 50, it could be a 35, an 85, a 105, a 16 millimeter lens. Anything where there's one singular number and that lens doesn't zoom. Typically we like prime lenses because we can get the lowest maximum aperture possible. So in this case we get a 1.4 on this lens, which would give us a really nice bokeh effect. We'd be able to blur the background out, focus on our subject matter, and we'd really get good sharp detail on that. And that's what you get when you buy one of those more expensive lenses that have an aperture like that. Telephoto or zoom lenses. So those are the next ones up. Telephoto or zooms are the opposite of primes because a telephoto lens is going to be a variable zoom lens. So where that one is a 50 millimeter, this one's going to go from 24 to 70. And And then where that one's a 24 to 70, this one is either a 70 to 200 or it is a 100 to 200. I believe they don't make a 100 to 200. I think that's a 70 to 200. Regardless though, same idea. You're basically going from one variation of your zoom into then a tighter focus. So if your 70 millimeter gives you this much space, as you start to zoom to 200, you're narrowing that field of view, bringing in more compression, but then seeing things that are farther away. Prime lens versus zoom lens. Prime lenses, lower maximum aperture. You get all the way to 1.2, 1.4, really nice background blur. The downside to using one of those is that if you want to zoom in or zoom out, there is no way to do it. So you got to move yourself. So on my Sony, for example, I traditionally only use my 50 millimeter lens on there. It's my favorite lens on that camera. If I were to take a picture of you two and I didn't like the angle that you're in, I basically would either have to say, hey, let's move over there or come closer, or I would then have to physically get closer or back up from you. That's the downside to a prime. On the flip side, you've got your zoom lens. Your zoom lens gives you that. So if I wanted to take a picture of you, I could just readjust my zoom to make sure you're perfectly in the frame and then capture the image. The downside to doing that though is that my maximum f-stop on a zoom lens is 2.8. Now, best glass in the world, it's going to still always be a 2.8. Now, I have heard rumors that you can find very, very, very expensive lenses made by third-party companies that are, upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 that you can get down to a 1.4. I have never seen one in person, nor would I ever want to, because I would probably lose my mind if I had to touch something that expensive. We have a $10,000 lens downstairs, and when I had to put that on display, I was shaking. I was so nervous. I'm like, I don't want to touch this again. 2.8 maximum. They're also heavier. They're bulkier. So when you put that on your camera, you will feel the weight differential. And that might bother people. That might upset, especially if you've got a sensitive neck or you just can't hold that much in your hands without shaking. That's where tripods come in, and that's why when you see these guys at sporting events or anything else, they might even have a monopod where they've got the camera down with a pole and they're able to then pick up and then just kind of move when they need to get out of the way. So people can go that route too. And the last one that I'll talk about before then the main set of lenses you should be using is the travel lens. Travel lens is going to have one of the worst apertures possible, so in this case 3.5 to 5.6. But the cool part about this is that this is an 18 to 200 millimeter lens. So if you're someone who doesn't want to replace your lenses or change stuff on the go, you're worried about damaging the sensor or getting something stuck in the camera, or maybe you just hate that you have to take lenses off and put new lenses on, a travel lens is a really cheap alternative. You're going to sacrifice your aperture, and you're going to sacrifice the quality of the glass because it necessarily won't be the best. But what you're getting out of it is the fact that you don't have to keep changing lenses when you want to go from taking the scenic honeymoon photos to seeing the bird flying in the distance and you're like, that's cool. You could just use this. But what lenses do you need? And I put quotations around need because I'll be honest with you, I have 2 lenses for my one camera and 1 lens for my other, and that's all I use, and it gets me through any job, gig, or demonstration I have to do with my camera. But this is considered the Trinity. If you can have all 3 of these lenses, you're covered. So the first is always your 50. This is for the family photos, for the perfect still photography, for the one where you can blur the background out, get the most detailed, sharpest image quality possible. A prime lens delivers that to you. Typically, the 50-50 or the 50 millimeter lens is the way to go. Sometimes using a 85, some people prefer a 35 for their prime, but I always recommend have one prime with you when you do things. From there, having something like a 24 to 70, and I use this lens for my example there. 24 is going to be your wide angle, 70 is more of your portrait. You get the top of the line glass with that f-stop 2.8. I think that is the most versatile lens you could have. 18 to 45 would be the same thing as that type of lens. So the one that you have there, I think that is the best lens to have, depending on what you want to do. For me, these 2 lenses, I'm set. I have a 35 millimeter lens and an 18 to 55 for my one camera, and I can do anything I want to do with it. What I can't do is zoom very far. And that's where then something like 70 to 200, and I put the plus there because you can go even higher than that. They make the 100 to 300. I know even Sony, I've seen 200 to 600, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, you can get a really big telephoto lens if that's something you need. I would say majority of photographers that I meet don't need that. Certain photographers do, certain photographers don't. I would say, John, you're a good example. I don't think that you need the biggest zoom lens from what we've talked about you doing. I think that your 24 to 105 there.
We're looking at the 100 to 300 or 200. I don't know.
Not
Yeah, that's right.
So yeah, some people need it, some people don't. Everybody's a little different on there, but this is considered the perfect trinity. If you've got these three lenses, you're set. That's all I got for you. I definitely took this past 7 o'clock, so I appreciate you guys sticking with me.
How many liters is this bag? And I'm just wondering, because did the one you ordered for me ever come in?
Never
'Cause
came in. I'm waiting on it still.
I'm leaving for Alaska in a couple of days too, so I was gonna ask you where you're going, but,
Literally, yeah.
Where you going on?
Bristol Bay, I'm going fishing,
Oh, yeah, we're going on a cruise, so.
inside passage.
Yeah,
Oh,
our first delve into photography and our first cruise.
made a great choice. That's a really great travel camera because it's so small and compact, but it's a Canon, so you're going to get beautiful color out of it. The only downside is the crop sensor, but even with a crop sensor camera, unless you plan on doing a lot of editing or changing of stuff, having that amount of space, that's more than
I
enough.
just wanted pictures and I wanna be able to,
Get them on the computer easy.
New
Done.
hobby for him.
Done. That's perfect. I would say from here on out, the only thing you should be considering to get like better ones of are the lenses. Just keep investing in the lenses as you have time and money.
well, we're gonna start with this, see like that, like Saturday I got a family thing to go to, so I'm gonna take the camera
Very nice.
with the smaller lens
Yeah.
and just start shooting with that and see how it works that.
That'd be awesome.
The only question I have is, and I'm not sure my wife mentioned it, do I have to program the, what's it called? I don't
The
think
SD
it's-
card.
Yes,
No. So in the camera settings, when you put the SD card in, you can format the card.
Format is.
Format is a great thing to do. All it's doing is it's deleting all the information from the card that was previously on there, and it's making sure that the SD card space is optimized for that camera.
Okay, we watched YouTube this morning and they said to do that.
Yeah, I recommend doing it. And just look it up online. If you type in how to format card on R100, you should get 7-8 videos. It'll only take 2 minutes to do it.
So do you rotate it every month, like?
Yeah. So every week we do a different class. We have 4 classes per
Okay.
month. So we do intro, that was last month. This week was intermediate. Next week on Thursday will be advanced. That's more about photo editing and going through and changing stuff on there. I teach the very basics of it, and then from there I answer questions because I'm experienced with Photoshop and everything else. I just don't use it too often myself.
Okay.
I like the natural camera picture that comes out of my camera. But that's what that class is geared towards. And then the last Thursday of every month we do beyond the traditional camera, which I think most people don't need that here.
I'll be in Alaska then, so I don't worry about that.
That one is more about drones, GoPros, basically the next step where you've got awesome video and picture out of this. You're like, what do I do next?
And can anybody come?
Yeah,
Or-
anybody.
Do we have, YouTube?
Just go to YouTube. So go to Apt Electronics, subscribe to the page. At 5:30, you'll get a notification on there that says, "Hey, Apt is going live with a video. Do you want to join?" And then you can
Okay.
just jump right on. And then they should have a little chat box section so you can say any questions that you want. And same thing, just say them immediately. And as I see them pour through, I'll start answering them. Most people don't chat on the website.
We tried to look for the videos
The past
on
ones.
YouTube from
YouTube.
here,
Yeah.
and we just couldn't find it.
Did you scan the back of that the
No,
class?
we were just talking to our remote.
Yeah. So when you go, if you do it, just take your camera out on your phone and scan that, and it'll take
Okay.
you right to the playlist of every video from my past one. There's probably about 30, 40 of these camera class videos on there. But they're all relatively the same. And same thing, if there's no questions right now, obviously you're so new to this that there might not be, take a picture of my email, my phone number, unless you got my card, and then my recommendation is always email me any problems with pictures and videos. That's usually the easiest way to get a hold of me. I know with the Aaron Network too. But yeah, just let me know of anything that comes up, and I can usually get around it.
It'd be interesting for my brother, he travels the world.
Yeah.
And they just came back, he's got a Sony, I don't know.
Yeah.
But he was very, interested when we said we were coming
Yeah.
here.
It's fun. I really enjoy teaching these, and I tell people all the time. I mean, it's a big investment to buy one of these cameras, no matter what level or price point that you're at with them. And when you have no prior experience to it, you're just kind of jumping in. It's like for most people, it's the phone does so. You're ready for the next step, and it's
Well, that's what
What
I
days
told
do you work?
Yeah.
You,
every day except Tuesdays and Wednesdays. If you took my card, it should be on there. If not, when you go back downstairs,
well,
that's
the only
small.
card I got is just about the class.
Oh,
There was
perfect.
nothing with that.
Ask them when you get down there for Saxon's card. I don't have any on me right now, but they'll give you one right away.
Yeah, because I may have questions after Saturday.
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, send it away.
So why do you use the auto zoom button? I mean, is it just see if somebody's in focus? Well, here, there's an AF.
When you hit the zoom
Yeah,
on that
it
guy.
zooms in and some spot. Is that just to see if, the picture you took, something's in focus that you want?
That's mainly the reason. Yeah, I use the zoom button to then see the crispness on there and to kind of go through with my camera, since I have that R5 model of that. When I use the 61 meg, I can literally get into people's wrinkles on their foreheads and see the freckles and everything else.
But is
So-
it just, why would you wanna do that if you can't save it? Or
Well-
just see if it's in focus?
Yeah, to see if it's in focus, and then possibly to do that on my computer, because then I can just do that on my computer as well too. I can go back down and do the same thing.
Thank
Guys,
you very
thanks for
much.
coming.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
One other question, the G button, what is that for and how does that work?
This is a customizable button on there.
It's a focus hold, I think,
Yeah, it's a
right?
focus hold, or in the settings you sometimes can change it, but yeah, it's a focus hold on that guy. So
how
same.
How does that work?
So it's when I was talking about that one button on the camera body, if you hold that button and then you move over, it's gonna stay focused at that exact rate that you were focused at. So where it's really nice is like, my example would be for like, if you're taking pictures of a bunch of flowers that are in a row, let's say each flower is perfectly in place, you hold that button on the lens down, and then you can literally just click, and go through. The lens itself will stay focused on the subject matter at that exact same distance you were at, and you're basically holding the focus as you continue to move.
Okay. So when you push it down, it's there, and it seems like there's a process to unlock it.
We could try it. I mean, we could try right now. If not, I can send you a video on it.
Maybe send me a video. I was trying to look at the book and I didn't really understand what it was.
You're good. I'm gonna put a note on my.
Hold button while pressing the shutter halfway down to start the autofocusing again. I mean, that's how you take it off, I guess, right? And that bag, well,
No bag. I even contacted Peak. They said for whatever reason, the blue and the black one, it's
Right.
taken a while to get to us.
I'm gonna take my other camera to Alaska because I don't want to take
No, we'll
this.
get the bag from online. You can get it on Amazon or somebody. I would have only gotten like $20 off that guy, but I won't.
Oh, it's the same bag?
Yeah, get the same bag. Peak
Who
Design.
makes
6 liter.
that bag?
Peak Design.
Peak?
Peak Design. Yeah.
Pete or peak?
Peak, like a peak of a mountain.
Okay.
So,
And you don't know if his was a 6 liter or not, right?
His was probably about a 4 liter. His was a little bit smaller, it looked like. Also, that firmware update, did we ever?
I did it.
Okay, and has it anything?
I haven't used it that much.
Okay.
But did you notice it last week?
I noticed it, but it did it sporadically and then it stopped. And I remember I asked you, and we
Yeah.
kind of like looked and then nothing. But then when you sent me that last video, it was doing that so much. Where he said Aaron, he then sent it to me and said, "You know anything?" And I was like, "This is Greg's camera, right?" And he was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Ah, yeah, he showed me this the other day, and it was doing that slightly." But the Leica guy, everybody that I talked to about it, because I got on the phone with them, and they said the same thing. They're like, "Just do that firmware update, confirm it's done."
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
done.
when,
I was on the phone with the guy for like 30 minutes or whatever, and it was, I mean, I don't think it was the easiest thing,
Yeah.
but we got it done and it's updated. I just haven't shot since.
Okay.
So,
Try
I don't
to
know.
No matter what, you're protected with Leica, and they'll make sure that you're taken care of. All that stuff's taken care of.
Yeah.
Because we're dealing with another thing where a lens that they had sent out had a particle on the inside of the lens, and they immediately wanted that thing back. They were going to refurbish and clean that thing out completely. So they do that kind of stuff all the time. So if there's anything wrong with that, it doesn't look right, just let me or Aaron know.
Got it. So I was shooting probably as far as a football field away, 100 to 400, and I was using burst,
Okay.
so you can see her. That's when she deflected the shot.
Yeah.
Hold on. Shots coming.
Okay.
So it's kind of cool. I don't know why I can't scroll through this.
So do this. So one of the things I recommend on Mac when you're going through, the best thing to do is go to the top bar here and switch to gallery mode. And
Okay.
then from there you can just use
Oh,
the
see, I
gallery
didn't know
mode.
that.
Yeah, so this is what I do. And then what I'll do on top of this to help me kind of go through my photos, I'll make this smaller. And then let's say I don't like a photo, I'll just drag that to the garbage can immediately.
Okay.
But I'll just keep swiping through to see my images. They'll take a little bit to load because this is such a powerful camera. There's a lot of megapixels. So as you click that button, it'll take like a point of a second to go.
So the shot comes here.
Let me mute my camera real quick. Sorry, guys. No one's really online, but I'm just gonna mute. Alright guys, thanks for being on today. It doesn't look like anybody else has any questions, but I will see everybody next week for advanced cameras. As always, keep taking photos, keep shooting out there, and I'll see you guys next week for another exciting class.